Hello everybody, and thank you for joining us on this episode of Activist Lawyer. I'm here in the Granite podcast studio with Jack.
Hello everybody.
And today we are delighted to be joined by Professor Louise Crowley. Hi Louise.
Hi Sarah, great to be on.
You're joining us from the School of Law at University College Cork, Ireland. So not in the studio today, but we are so grateful to have you take time out of your busy schedule to join us here. So Louise, just before we get stuck into some of the questions that we're going to cover today, like we ask all of our guests, I suppose, what, in terms of your legal journey, what inspired you to become a lawyer, to specialise in this area of law, and I suppose to opt for a career in academia? If you could take us through your journey, that would be fantastic.
Sure, yeah, and thanks Sarah for having me on the show. It's a real pleasure. How did I get to where I am? Well, I suppose I'm in UCC now 21 years, but I did begin life as a family law practitioner. So I went to college and studied law, and in my master's, the timing was very interesting. So I was doing my master's in law in 1996, 1997, at the time of the divorce referendum in Ireland and the introduction of the legal remedy of divorce at that time. So for my dissertation, I examined the financial provision made for parties applying for a divorce under Irish law, and the timing was just perfect. So I was the first person to publish in the area, and from my dissertation I produced 4 academic articles and contributed to 2 books. So I was getting real value for that work, and I think at that time I really enjoyed studying. I was always a very good student and really enjoyed studying law. But when I studied family law and the different aspects of family law at undergrad and again at master's level, I was really drawn to the area, and then had the opportunity to explore it in more depth in a really timely way with my master's. So I definitely had a draw for academia at that time. So with publications, whilst I was training to become a solicitor, was something that really excited me to be able to engage in what was then really contemporary public debate about divorce being introduced to Ireland, which was, such a landmark moment for women in Ireland, as well as more broadly, recognising the importance of the law being utilised to support people. So not to see law as something that was, necessarily punitive or anything like that, but rather as a tool to support an evolving society, to recognising the changing needs of Irish families, the move away from the strict ideology of the Catholic Church and recognising autonomy. So it was a really exciting time to be able to study that and to have the opportunity to kind of share my thoughts through academic publications. And so whilst I was training to qualify, and I was working in the area of family law when I was training, and also the brief period that I was in the office after qualifying. So I worked as a solicitor, fully qualified solicitor, for about 6 months. But during that time, a 1-year post came up in UCC as a lecturer, and I got the post. And I don't mind telling you that it was, it wasn't a difficult decision. I was delighted with it. Yeah. It was a significant pay cut. It also was just a 1-year contract, having trained for 3 years, in Blackhall Place. Sure. But there was never a doubt in my mind that that's where I wanted to use my knowledge. And I suppose I had an awakening then as to the capacity to influence not only law reform, but also public debate as an academic. And so that's kind of where the journey began in academia, and I've never looked back. I did miss the interaction with clients at the beginning, but very quickly found that it just was enriching engaging with students, and students from so many different backgrounds, different ages. The perception that, you're meeting all kind of 18-year-olds just out of school, but in UCC, certainly law led the way with mature students. So that's one of the areas I got very heavily involved in very quickly in UCC, and developed links with local PLCs, so students who went to PLCs rather than university as a different route to third level. So I developed links locally, which are now national links through the CAO, where students who do well on those courses can have a pathway into third level, and particularly into UCC. So really proud of being able to do that. So working in academia not only allows me to pursue my academic research in the area of family law, domestic violence, the regulation of families in an ever-changing Ireland, but also, as we'll come to, has given me a platform to develop education-based initiatives to address these on a really practical level with our staff and students and now beyond. And then I suppose the third element is my ability to develop programs and initiatives in the university, such as those connections with PLCs, colleges, as well as other kind of civic and community-based engagements that I can use my platform as an academic to pursue those. So really, I have to say I have a wonderful job. I'm really lucky. UCC gives me wonderful space and opportunity to use my platform to really try and affect change, for the good, not just at a university level, but also societally. And then, because of the times we're living in, there is such an appetite for information and education, and that is the foundation of everything that I do, which is using my position within education to both develop programs and also then to reach out to people and to support people on their own journeys of learning and change.
Yeah. Well, as you say, Louise, you started your career and your legal journey, I suppose, at a very exciting time. And I'm interested in that period of, I suppose, constitutional history and the development of family law in Ireland and in general citizens' rights stemming from that period. So, as we know, Ireland is seeing, significant changes in recent times. We have same-sex marriage, made headlines around the world leading up to the referendum around repealing the 8th Amendment. So you've published widely on many aspects of family law. Just in general, I mean, the answer is probably yes to this, but just if you could take us through it. I mean, there must be a real noticeable shift in the development of family law and attached or associated rights since you started out in your career? Or is Ireland still seen as a slow burner, when it comes to matters like divorce, for example? I know we have it there, but, can we go further? Are we up to speed with other European countries, for example?
Yeah, so I mean, the first thing I would say to that is that we are very slow. We respond slowly. We don't generally lead out on these areas. And I mean, and yet we have made such strides in the last 20 years. So I always talk to my students, particularly my undergrad students, about when I was a student in the early 90s and how the family law that I'm teaching now is a completely different world to what I would have studied. And even the environment within which I would have lived and socialised and studied is a completely different environment. It's a different Ireland and a much better Ireland and a much more diverse and welcoming and inclusive Ireland, much more respectful Ireland in terms of individual rights and respecting difference. And I think that's a really key thing here. So certainly my notes change every year in family law, which is a wonderful thing. It means we don't stand still anymore in family law. But we were certainly behind the curve in terms of supporting people who found themselves in the most difficult situations. And yet the law very often was quite discriminatory in terms of who it might protect and who it wouldn't protect. In the context of domestic violence, the fact that up until 1996, you could only seek court support for domestic violence orders if you were married. So the notion that you were in an intimate relationship, which may cause vulnerability, may give rise to abuse, that you couldn't get state protection if you were cohabiting but not married, this notion of a deserving applicant. And for me, that's a very striking position for Ireland to have taken for so long. And thankfully now, with the Domestic Violence Act of 2018, we see the recognition of all people who could be vulnerable and the state's obligation. And that's the thing, the state has awoken to its obligation to support all individuals in those circumstances. Less progressive would be our concept of a family. Article 41 of the Constitution in the 1937 version identified the family, as a fundamental unit of society with inalienable and imprescriptible rights, really elevating the family, recognising it as fundamental to social well-being and to individual good coming together as a collective. But unfortunately, Article 41.3 references the fact that this fundamental unit group of society is based on marriage. And so as a result, the courts have repeatedly focused on this quite clear statement. I don't know that they could have interpreted it in any other way, and certainly didn't choose to. And as a result, anyone who isn't part of a married family is simply not regarded as associated with constitutional protection. And there's been all sorts of consequences, ones that continue with us today. The plight of the unmarried father who has no legal standing the moment the child is born up until 2015. Now the unmarried father who has cohabited with the mother of the child 12 months, including 3 months post the birth of the child, can assert automatic legal guardianship. But even that in itself can be a he said, she said, difficult one to prove. There is such the suggestion that a married father is a much better positioned father than an unmarried father simply has no grounding in any sense. And even if you look at the 1964 Act, a father is defined as a man who is married to the mother of the child. This notion that the suitability of your relationship with the other adult defines your status as a parent, and if you try to think about that rationally, it just doesn't make any sense. So, we have, and similarly with historically same-sex couples, one-parent families, all very much discriminated against. So we have absolutely made inroads, and we should applaud those inroads. Interestingly, I think it's really worth noting that the biggest steps that we've taken in recent years have all been led by the people. So they have been driven through, in my opinion, a lack of sufficient political appetite or bravery, perhaps, to address these really challenging issues. I mean, Repeal the 8 has been on the radar for 20 years.
Absolutely.
But, it was sidestepped repeatedly, and it was only with the will of the people giving rise to the Citizens' Assembly, giving rise to the real push, the knocking on the doors, the people power that made that happen. It's the same with marriage equality. The stories, and so it's just the story, and for me, it's the stories of people on the ground that sway the vote. It's the realising the lived reality of individuals and the way in which the law can so cruelly deprive people of their rights or discriminate against people based on, long-standing traditional ideology that simply, in many cases doesn't have a place in Ireland anymore. And I absolutely respect, individual choice, religious choice, and I recognise if there's a majority, but that majority just doesn't give rise to then, equivalent laws applying to everybody. That is simply wrong, and so, it's all about choice, allowing opportunity, and then let people make their own decisions. But, applying that blanket ban or blanket position on everybody based on ideology from 1937 is simply unacceptable. And I'm so proud of Ireland and the people of Ireland to have pushed for this and pushed through the political resistance to make it happen. And long may people feel that they have a voice that will be heard.
But you're right. I mean, even behind Article 41.2, I think it is, even the wording of that still shocks people to this day, that it's so belonging to its time and so archaic. But again, it's the people behind that, and there's so many recommendations for change come out of that, and people are saying, well, it's just wording, it belongs to a different time. But no, I mean, to make changes that really affect people in Ireland, will call for that to be removed. What's the status with that now, Louise, in terms of, I think a few recommendations in a report come out of the the citizens' referendum, and that would that be a possibility that could be held next year to amend or remove that?
Yeah, so there was, in July of this year, the Citizens' Assembly produced a report, and they strongly recommended the reform of Article 41. Firstly, to recognise that it shouldn't be simply the family based on marriage, that in light of Irish society, the multiple family formations, that it no longer is appropriate to have this hierarchy of families where only constitutional status can apply to married families. In relation to Article 41.2 and the position of the woman in the home, I think there was all but 100% unanimous support for that to be addressed. Now, the issue that we faced in 2019 when we looked at having the referendum, which was eventually dropped on this issue, is how do we reword it? And that's the real challenge. So, I mean, there is an argument for deleting it entirely, that it has no place anymore. I would feel that is perhaps very appropriate on one level. I mean, it's so gender-based and so inappropriate, and acknowledging the woman's duties in the home, quote unquote, and and yet it's so meaningless, because it talks about a woman should not, by economic necessity, be forced to work outside the home to the neglect of her duties. And yet, what does a woman receive if she is working in the home to support that decision? So for me, it's words and very little else, because women have tried to rely upon it historically in the courts, and it has not been recognised as giving them a right that is justiciable. So, it is quite weak as regards its substance. However, at the same time, I think that the incredible contribution that people, and I say that gender neutral specifically, that people make in the home, the contribution they make to, whether they're married or unmarried, by the way, the contribution that they make, whether it's carers for elderly people, for young people, for people with disabilities, that is a hugely important fabric of Irish society. And there is a need for that not to be ignored. And there is something symbolic about recognising in the Constitution, but a big caveat, I think we need to be very careful what we use the Constitution for. And if we have words in the Constitution, they have to have meaning and they have to be intended. Sure. So I don't know that maintaining in the Constitution is necessary for people to be recognised symbolically or otherwise, or financially, as regards what they do for Irish people individually and as a collective society. I struggle with putting it in the Constitution as being thought to be the only way or the most appropriate way to recognise that. I don't think that's necessary, and I don't think it should necessarily be maintained in the Constitution simply because that's where it began. But if it is maintained in the Constitution, it needs to be gender neutral. It needs to recognise that it's more than a mother caring for her child. But equally then, we need to be very cautious that if we're recognising the fact of carers or the rights of carers, we need to make sure that we're not creating a new hierarchy where the rights of carers may, in some instances, supersede the rights of those who are being cared. So just in certain circumstances, that might be very dangerous. So the wording is so important. Yeah. And I understand that's why ultimately that part of the referendum in 2019 was dropped, because of at the time, they simply couldn't come up with the best new version. So that's an ongoing conversation. I'm not quite sure what that will look like, but certainly as regards Article 41 and the limited reference to the family, we need to move towards the Article 8 of the European Convention on Human Rights approach, which recognises the function of the relationship in question rather than the form. Because if we're only looking at the form, so you walk up an aisle and you get married, so suddenly you are presumed to be the superior family formation with all of the associated rights. And for me, one doesn't follow the other. And then the negative implication of that, where those who don't walk up the aisle are a less than family, equally, that's just insulting. So how we resolve that, I don't have all the answers, but what we're doing right now isn't working as far as I'm concerned.
Absolutely. And stemming on for that, I suppose we're looking at how the law changes constitutionally and legislatively, but in terms of societal change in attitude in Ireland, how is that reflected in your opinion, or I don't know whether your research really looks into that in terms of, for example, domestic violence within the home, whether it's between a married couple or not. There is a sense that people always, looked at it as a private matter, something not to intervene in. How do you think, for example, domestic violence, people are protected? Can the law do more in Ireland? Is this something that still needs further work as we kind of witness change, historical change when it comes to family law and associated rights? Yeah,
so I think that traditionally the law, along with society and culture in Ireland, have kept intimate partner abuse, particularly in the home, very private. And there is a school of thought that would say, oh, that's because we respect the privacy and the autonomy of the family and it's not to be involved. But we're fooling no one when we say things like that. And I think that so long as you keep the veil over the activities of people within the home, you are ultimately protecting perpetrators, and you are giving them the opportunity to continue to perpetrate and escalate their behaviour, and failing to protect the most vulnerable. And if the law is to serve any purpose in society, it has to begin with protecting the most vulnerable in our society, whether they're children, whether they're abused partners, whoever they may be. So as far as I'm concerned, for change to happen, we need, in Ireland, we typically lead with eventually admitting to a problem or a situation that needs to be addressed, followed by public debate, followed by the law. So it takes a while. It's like we almost have to warm up to it. We need to challenge the too often absolutely entrenched views, such as, oh, that's none of our business, they're a married family, or, that they're a married, so this, that, or the other. And then eventually we might get to legal change. And when we do get to legal change, I suppose the one benefit of the slower nature of Irish evolution of law is that we can reflect on the experiences of other jurisdictions. Yeah. And when we do that, we can do that very well, because we learn from what they've done and what has worked for them. And we could do that a bit more. We could look perhaps further afield and be a bit more creative about our legislative responses. I suppose there is caution typically in Irish remedies being developed, but I think that we have more of an appetite now for more creative approaches, now that we've seen the way in which law can impact. So I was talking about law as a social tool, and law can be used as a kind of a preemptive social tool that it can encourage behavioural change. But I think at the moment in Ireland, if you were to gauge the way in which we've evolved, for domestic violence, for example, so we have now developed our laws with the 2018 Act, but to be honest, that was very much pushed by the Istanbul Convention and our obligations under the Istanbul Convention, and I welcome that, because I don't know that we would have been so progressive had we been left to our own devices. And with that has come destigmatization of domestic and intimate partner abuse. In other words, that people are now more likely to come forward. They are welcomed and supported more than they were. I'm not saying they're always welcome and supported, but there is greater visibility of the issue. There's greater recognition of the prevalence of it. And also, from my point of view, from my work, a realization that just because you're not directly involved, it doesn't mean that you don't have a role to play. And as I always say to my students, if you see something or you're aware of some behaviour and you've nothing to do with it, you're not either the victim or the perpetrator, but you see it and you do nothing about it, well, as far as I'm concerned, you're part of the problem. And I think that you are. And there's a growing recognition that we all have a role to play. And really, in terms of culture, for me, one of the most important things that we need to do is we need to cultivate that sense of personal responsibility for the well-being of others and our capacity to influence what is perceived to be acceptable behaviour. So we shouldn't just follow what seems to be acceptable, actually demand a certain level of respect, demand a certain type of behaviour, and, you know, say zero tolerance of all forms of abuse. And that has to come from the ground up. That has to be a shared desire and a shared demand, because until we do that, so much unacceptable behaviour will be regarded simply as a social norm and will be almost become part of normal existence in terms of perception. And so long as we stay silent, that creep will continue. So the law certainly brings the headlines and brings our attention to it, but it's about actually those conversations that people have, you know, in their own circles, with their peers, with their families. And because you never know who you're talking to, you never know who's in the circle of people in your room. I mean, if there's 10 students in front of me, I'm pretty sure that at least one of them is either currently or has been in an abusive relationship. And perhaps one perpetrator in the room, maybe you need a bit more for one perpetrator to be in every room. But certainly this is so prevalent that, you know, if you're having these conversations, you don't know how people are hearing them, what experiences they have or are currently having. And so I think that if we can have more of these conversations that are educated and informed, and people realise the role that they have to play, and that is huge. That's as important, if not more important, than the legal structures being in place.
Yeah, really interesting. And that really leads us nicely into our next section. You spoke about your work giving you a platform to make change, and you have made monumental strides in terms of the next issue that we're going to talk about. And really, Louise, I got to know you through addressing your work on sexual violence and harassment, particularly at third level education, when I worked a few years back with the National Women's Council of Ireland. You know that the project was the It Stops Now project, where we worked with students and staff throughout the island of Ireland. However, you in University College Cork and your colleagues work towards achieving a zero tolerance approach against sexual violence, not only on your campus, but by creating, I suppose, a blueprint that could be used widely to address the issue, the bystander. And you've spoken a little bit about it there in a general sense in terms of all levels of abuse. But can you tell us more about the Bystander Intervention Programme in UCC and what you've been working on and how this has come about for our listeners?
Sure, Sarah. So this programme, its genesis began in about 2016, and credit to my colleague Rachel Fenton in the UK, who developed the Intervention Initiative, which was funded by Public Health England. And you spoke about a blueprint or a toolkit. Rachel developed a toolkit for third level institutions in the UK. So I met with Rachel back in 2016. I was really interested in developing something similar in the Irish context. So Rachel came to UCC, and we had an open session, and then we also had sort of a workshop about what we could do. And she's incredibly generous and said, you know, you can use this and create your own version of it. So we did modify it quite a bit, and we had 2 years of a pilot with first law students in 2016, and then in 2017 with first year law students, first year nursing and midwifery, and then undergrad students from the School of Applied Psychology. And the program, in essence, is, to put it simply, it does two things. So it educates the participants on, you know, all the relevant areas. So educates them about what it is to be a pro-social bystander, the 4 stages of intervention, which is, you know, you see something, second, you recognise it as problematic, thirdly, you have a sense of responsibility to do something about it, and fourthly, then you have the skills to make an effective intervention. So we talk them through that whole process. We reflect on intervention inhibition, so what might prevent you from making an intervention, and there's, you know, a lot of theory that underlies that, but we share that with students and then talk to them about their own experience of times when they may have walked by or chosen not to intervene, you know, and working through that. And then we also do a deep dive into, you know, all of the ways in which sexual harassment and violence can manifest. And that's really important because whilst obviously rape and aggravated sexual assaults and sexual assaults are horrific and life-changing experiences for, you know, victims of such incidents, it's really important that we speak to the whole spectrum of behaviour, because my fear would be that so many people in the data tells us, you know, experience sexual hostility on a regular basis, but more at the end of, you know, lewd comments or leering or groping or, you know, unwanted images to their phone. And my fear is that if we focus exclusively on, you know, the more horrific incidents of sexual assault, that so many people will think, oh, this has nothing to do with me. But actually, I'm strongly of the view that it has to do with everybody. And that, unfortunately, we know the majority of our students from the very start of third level are experiencing sexual hostility. So whether they're the victim or they're the perpetrator, or perhaps both, or indeed the witness, that we need all participants to realise the breadth of behaviour that we're talking about, and also that none of it is acceptable and all of it is traumatic. So we work through that, and then we talk about the law, we talk about consent, and obviously all understanding consent and how to communicate it and how to recognise it, and all of the conversations around that. And then we can, talk about toxic relationships, so students can understand what that looks like, whether it's them, whether it's somebody else. And then moving towards that idea of cultivating personal responsibility as well as collective responsibility across campus. This is your campus. You're entitled to a respectful experience, so are all of your colleagues. Social norms, getting the students to realise the dangers of not speaking up and how social norms can change if we're silent, and unacceptable behaviour can creep in and normalised. And then we move towards the second part, which is empowering. So working with the students on all the different ways an intervention can take place. And something that's really interesting in that piece is almost all students say when they finish the training, oh God, I always thought, I had to swoop in and be dramatic and, and rescue somebody if I make an intervention. And they come to realise that interventions can look like so many different things. They can be direct or indirect, verbal or non-verbal. They can be simply moving somebody from a situation, distracting somebody, and stopping somebody and saying that please direct me to wherever, breaking into what looks like a troublesome situation and just distracting them. That it can happen in so many ways, not laughing at a joke, and also that an intervention supporting somebody if they disclose an incident to you. That the roles that we can all play to make society safer, in a very proactive way, but also to be able to support people and stand in solidarity and to know how to say it and what to say and how to direct them to the right services. That these are all roles that we can all play if we simply can recognise unacceptable behaviour. We can learn how to respond, whether it's a direct intervention or a supporting piece. And really underlying all of that is about cultural change. It's about everybody recognising their role, and if we all step up together, well, suddenly those who are perpetrating become the outliers. So they go from being the unchallenged perpetrators, whose behaviour is almost normalised, to being the ones who are the outliers. They're the behaviour that we're all talking about. And who wants to be in that position? So unless they're a very intense perpetrator, the people in the middle, the people who are going along for the crack in inverted commas, who think that this is all okay, it's just banter or whatever they might call it, they'll suddenly realise that that's not the place in history that they want to be in. They actually don't want to be part of that, and they will come over and recognise that actually speaking up and being brave about it is a much better place to be. And we see that, and we hear it in the students' responses, we see it in our focus groups and in the feedback that we get back from students, and they feel so empowered. And so I would say grateful to have the opportunity to learn so much and then to see how they themselves can make a difference. And it is empowering and really powerful to watch their responses when they come through the training.
Yeah, you can really see the difference that it makes. And I mean, it's so prevalent. It's just, I mean, when I was in college, this just didn't exist, this level of training. You were really interested in finding out more about it, Jack, a student yourself.
Yeah, no, as a student myself. So, Louise, obviously sexual harassment, sexual violence is a difficult topic to talk about for many people. So how have you kept students engaged? Do you work with student societies? Do you take in students that are just interested in the area, or is it important for you to bring everybody within the university campus on board?
Yeah, so I mean, in my ideal world, nobody would get into UCC until they had started the training, because for me, it really asserts our position as a university and as a campus that, a basic ground rule is respect for everyone and understanding what unacceptable behaviour looks like, but also being empowered to know that you can recognise it and that you can make a difference. And I think that if everybody takes the training, it gives rise to conversations right across the board, and that shared ownership of the capacity for change. But I suppose to answer your question directly, Jack, recruiting students is a bit of a challenge. So, we always have the students who are interested, want to learn more, see them immediately and sign up immediately. So we do now have a compulsory training for first years, which is a shorter sort of introductory guide to Bystander. So all of those key messages that I mentioned are included in that, and that's it's a recorded piece, and it's very student-led. So I had students involved who completed the training, sharing their experience, sharing their learning, as well as some narrative from me. But as regards engaging with students, so this is a big part of our work. And in the last 18 to 24 months, we have really embraced the multiple ways to engage students. So obviously, every student and staff member can sign up to it now because it's delivered predominantly online. So they do about 2 hours of training online, 4 modules. It's self-directed. There is lovely engagement through it, through use of discussion boards and Padlet, and also quizzes. But then they have a final workshop in person where they reflect with others who've completed the training on their learning, and that's a really valuable piece where they're with like-minded people and they get this sense of, this is a collective endeavour. But what we've done now more recently is we're working in a couple of different ways. So it's embedded in a number of undergraduate and postgraduate programs. So just last week I gave a 2-hour seminar to our MA and Women's Studies students on gender violence, and tomorrow they will have the in-person workshop, having done the training over the last week in anticipation of the workshop tomorrow. So we've done that now in a number of schools, and that's really valuable. And that is real buy-in from the school or the unit at a local level, where they want their school to be informed and for their culture to be changed with the use of Bystander. And then other things we do, so the students union UCC, they all take the training automatically when they become officers of the union, and then they become wonderful ambassadors for us. And then we are developing a new project whereby we will have consent reps for every club and society. So we're running a pilot this year. And the idea then is that we will deliver training, and we've started already delivering training to individual clubs and societies. So when you get them all together, what you're doing is that they're all buying into it. And that's a wonderful, way of getting into it. And also we're working with UCC Sports. So pre-COVID, we had a great plan. Now we're just waiting on a bit of normality. But my vision for this is that, say, for example, we get maybe the men's hockey team and the women's hockey teams together. So in my head, I see 100 hockey players of mixed gender in a large hall, and I will deliver, I suppose, a truncated version, maybe an hour long, of the key learning. And then the second hour would be breaking them into groups of 10, where we give them scenarios that are suited to their lived experience as hockey players and students within the university, fictional, but pretty much premised on their experiences, and we'd work with them in developing them, and then leave it to them in groups to consider what was wrong in this scenario and then how one might respond. And that's a learning lesson in itself, to respond to that task. But what we're doing is that I'm not telling them what to do or what to say, but they're discussing it with each other. So straight away we'll have peer-led learning within the context, looking at it from the different gendered perspectives and speaking to their experiences. And I know from the pilot, which we did in person for 2 years, that some of the key learning is when students listen to each other and realise what it's like to be someone else. So I particularly remember in 2016 with the first year law students, I remember distinctly the male students in the class, their jaws dropped when they heard what it was like to be a 19-year-old female law student going out on a Saturday night, trying to get home, and all of the issues that they faced. And they literally, it wasn't that they didn't want to know, they just didn't know, they weren't aware. And that awareness is so valuable, because you open your eyes and suddenly you see all the ways in which actually you could support and affect a safer place, even if it's not just for you, but it's for others. And for me, that willingness and desire for those male students at that time to want, desperate to learn and to stand with their female colleagues, and then on a Saturday night be aware and be able to step in, in quite a discreet way right next to it. But if they didn't know to see it, how could they ever make the intervention? So with the club and the sporting groups, what we want to do is give them the scenarios that allows the conversations to start. They'll have the learning from me and then apply it. And then I think that if they find themselves in a changing room or in a pub or at a match away and they're going on the bus, they all have this knowledge now. And even if you do it that way, because I think part of the question, Jack, speaks to the challenge of getting those who need it most, those who need the training most will be the last to sign up in a voluntary system, most likely. And so how do you get them to hear it? So I think when you do it through a school basis or through a club or society or a sports group basis, they will be in the room and they will hear it. And the joy of Bystander, and I always say this, the joy of bystander intervention is that you're speaking to everybody in their capacity as a bystander. So I'm not looking at you, Jack, thinking, I've heard Jack, can cause a lot of trouble, so I'm speaking to him as a perpetrator or someone as a survivor or victim. Rather, we're speaking to the best part of everyone, and we know, and I've looked at the psychology studies, that they're, that everybody wants to find the hero in themselves. And so when I speak to everybody about being an effective bystander who can make a difference and affect change, that's how they're hearing it. So even if they might be a perpetrator or a potential perpetrator, you're teaching them this without being in any way stigmatizing them or accusatory in any way. And it's a very nuanced, but I think very effective way of bringing the education to people without, pigeonholing them or suggesting in any way that they need this more than somebody else. So, I suppose the last thing I'd say on that is that I would be of the view, and my research it suggests to me that actually these programs are most effective when they're compulsory. So there's a long-standing sort of debate about whether, sex education and consent should be compulsory or voluntary. And we know that when consent classes were first introduced in the UK, there was a lot of so kind of social media posting of young men in particular, with a poster from saying, this is not what a rapist looks like, and all of that kind of negative and defensive responses to the training. And so when we introduced Bystander in 2016, I managed to make it compulsory for first year law students, such that even if they were the best law students in the class, they couldn't get into second year if they hadn't completed the training. So that was a bit radical, but it was the university recognising that this is actually really valuable. And it was the only way that I could get that value attached to it. So the students all had to do it. They had no choice. And I was fearful of a bit of backlash. I didn't get any. And in fact, so two things. Our focus groups, they all said, thank you so much for making me do this. Bystander intervention, I didn't even know what that meant, but I knew I had to go. But once I had finished that first hour, and it was 6 hours, once I finished that first hour, I wanted to learn more. And when we look at the data of attendance, and the majority of law students that year, and believe me, law students know rules and regulations, and if they only have to attend 3 and they don't want to attend anymore, they won't. But the majority of law students that year attended 5 out of 6. And in the second year, 94% of the nursing and midwifery attended 4 of 6 hours. Oh, so the data tells us that it's a bit like, bring the horse to water and he will drink. So if you introduce this and you just make it automatically mandatory, so there's no questions asked, that has to be done. My research shows that people are so grateful for the opportunity, and sometimes they don't know until you present it to them. And so my position would strongly be, you can absolutely justify making this mandatory. And the impact of the data that I have in terms of the impact, and the students fill out a pre-workshop questionnaire, and then the same one when they've finished it. And the data in terms of the impact of the learning is phenomenal as regards their awareness of their ability to make a difference in the first place, and then their ability to make an intervention. It just goes through the roof as regards their own sense of their capacity to make an intervention. So by the time the 2020-21 group had finished, less than 1% felt that they couldn't make an intervention, whereas it was, in the 30s couldn't make an intervention, and another 30 thought they could only make a limited intervention. But we had 99% plus by the time it was over. 80% said yes, they could definitely, and 19% said, they could, but it might be limited. But nonetheless, 99% of them said, I can make an intervention. So it really makes a difference.
A huge impact.
The training.
We've had a look at those statistics. They're astonishing. And I've seen it in action, and you can really see how, people are really looking at their attitudes, norms, and it's about changing that culture too. But Louise, do you think should start a bit earlier in terms of even the discussion around consent? What's the feeling about bringing this conversation into secondary level education? I've only ever experienced it at third level. Would that make sense?
Yeah, so I mean, the very sad thing is that when we do bystander training with first years, I do every year have students coming to me with stories of how they've been raped or sexually assaulted. So we know students are coming to third level already experiencing sexual harassment and violence. And by definition, then we know we have students coming to first year who are perpetrating the violence. So I have worked with second level schools. So about in 2019, I invited all second level schools in Cork City and County into UCC, and we had a reasonable response, and we had a workshop. And what resulted from that was 9 schools signed up to developing a pilot for second level, and it was delivered over 2 years. So it was basically the bystander training, but every slide modified, and training the teachers to facilitate in their classroom. So it was delivered generally to TUL students, some particular students, and it was hugely well received. The feedback from the students was that for the first time, the training was relevant to them, the language was appropriate, it reflected what happened in their lives. So really, really powerful, very limited resources. So I don't have a huge amount of data on it, but just recently I have looked for funding for a new pilot. So again, I started off with 8 schools signing up, but the word is getting out. So I've had communications from schools in Galway, Kilkenny, Dublin, who want to come on board to this pilot. So my vision is to create 6 10-minute recordings on 6 of the key messages in Bystander, and then develop an instruction manual with teachers as we develop the pilot, whereby they will then, for 6 40-minute classes, deliver those 6 messages. So the 10 minutes will play, and then they will facilitate a workshop with their students. So we're working on that at the moment, and I really feel that it is so badly needed at second level. I know that there's a lot of work being done in Cork on consent. So my colleague Margot Noonan, who is a SAT in Sexual Assault Trauma Unit practitioner here in Cork, is just a phenomenal woman and a phenomenal worker in this area. And she delivers consent classes to schools right across the city. Fantastic. So there's a real appetite for it at second level.
Seems to be,
Yeah, and it's so badly needed. I have teenagers myself, and they have bystander coming out their ears, but I know from talking to them and what they see on their phones and the type of behaviour that they're exposed to, that it is badly needed. And yet there's an appetite for it, because I know from the pilot that we did do with second level, the teachers come back and they say the students really want to talk about this. And so it's about developing programs that give them a safe space and the language to talk about it, so that they can leave the classroom and be able to engage and ask the right questions and call out behaviour that's not acceptable, and feel that they have a right to do so, and hopefully eventually almost a sense of obligation to do so too, insofar as they can and insofar as it's safe for them to do so. I suppose on that too, Sarah, we need to start thinking about how we speak to younger people in primary school about consent and respect in their own space. And I've spoken at primary school level conferences about this, and honestly, some of the stories that I heard from principals about the type of behaviour that's happening, even at primary level, it really is a wake-up call for the importance of the conversation. And I know people say, well, these are conversations people should be having in their homes, but we can't rely on that. And I feel strongly as an educator that, we are uniquely positioned to develop programs, age appropriate, and to support the delivery of them. And I really feel that that's something that we ought to do. Yeah. And the state needs to support it too in terms of funding, because, every day we don't invest in this properly, people are being sexually assaulted and harassed. And, we have to make a difference. And education, as far as I'm concerned, is the start of everything. And if we educate people and they realise, what is going on, what's not acceptable, and what they can do, individually and collectively, I think that would make a huge change. And we see in UCC that it does make a change. So we have the data to show that it works. Equally, the consent workshops are so crucial, and these two programs are really complementary, and they have a role in working together to ensure that that interpersonal relationship space is really well understood as about consent, but then also that broader social responsibility, which is so important, because that's what speaks to the norms, and that's what establishes what's acceptable, and through that then we recognise consent and we understand it better.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure anyone involved in it would, have their eyes wide open. But as you said, it's absolutely crucial. And I hope going forward that, schools become involved, sign up to any programmes. But as you said, we need funding. It needs to come from a national funding strategy. But it's fantastic. I'm so glad that I got to be a part of it a little bit. But I love to hear how it's rolling out, and it really has taken legs. So well done to you and all of your colleagues in Cork around that. So I suppose
so obviously the work that you're doing is incredible. So one question that I had was, how do you combine campaigning for this zero tolerance culture on campus for sexual harassment, sexual violence, and then how do you combine that with your day-to-day academic work and legal work? How do you juggle all of those things?
I could do the lie down there, to be honest. But
I'm just thinking,
yeah. So it is just long hours. It's my work is never done. It sounds a bit dramatic, but literally my work is never done. So obviously it is a whole load of juggling. The days are long, but and more and more. I mean, it's wonderful that the issue is becoming so high profile. But the result of that is that every other day, so last night I was speaking at a conference at 7:30, and last Saturday I was speaking at a conference, and all on gender-based violence, from all the different perspectives. So my perspective as an academic in this area, my perspective as an advocate campaigner, and my perspective as an educator and someone who creates programs, and then and then in the political context. So I've spoken at Labour. I don't have any political allegiance, but I've spoken at a Labour conference in the last 4 weeks. I've spoken at a Green Party one, and it's really brilliant to have the opportunity and the platform to be able to raise this at all those different levels. So whether it's in schools, whether it's politically, whether it's in terms of advocacy and NGOs, working with student societies and UCC and spreading the message, which that the message is the same all the time, but there are so many different avenues, so many different people who need to hear it. So it just means that the work is kind of relentless, but in a really good way, because the busier I am, it means the more people I'm reaching. But I still have my full-time job as a professor of law in the law school, and I led out recently on our successful Swan application, which was for 18 months' work, which was a huge piece of work that I was so glad to be successful on. But another really important piece of work in terms of gender equality and the intersectionality issues that we face in having a fairer workplace in the law school in UCC. So that was brilliant. But again, I suppose the appetite for affecting change, and it's almost it's almost like an addiction of sorts, and that, you know, wherever I can see a gap that I can be heard, you know, you kind of drawn to it. So occasionally I take a breath, but in the meantime, you know, it is hard going, but the results are just so powerful and really, you know, phenomenally heartwarming that I can be that voice, and then of course empowering other people to be the voice. So, you know, we work with students to be bystander ambassadors within the UCC, as well as staff colleagues who are bystander ambassadors, and then, you know, just being able to share the bystander training, which we do free classes, you know, to any student in Ireland. They have our program, and I give them training on becoming facilitators within their own institutions. Again, all complementary, because the essence of this work, as far as I'm concerned, reflecting Rachel Fenton's generosity when I first started this work, is about sharing. So anybody who takes this training, I will happily give it to them and support them in rolling it out. So, you know, I'm not the only voice on this, and I want other people to stand up and be, you know, bystander ambassadors right across the sector and beyond the third level sector in Ireland, because, as I say, there are so many people who need to hear this, and so many sectors that we need to reach, that the more people who can, you know, I suppose, be experts in this and to share the knowledge, it's really crucial. So busy, but
busy is an understatement.
But when you make inroads, it makes it easier, I guess.
Absolutely. And I mean, obviously you can see results, and when you're speaking about your work, it's clear that you're extremely passionate. So the next question kind of almost has been answered, but just in your opinion, Louise, how important is it that we use law? I mean, we've had so many different people on this show, which has been fantastic, and they've all given their own opinions on it. But just with your area of work, how can we really use law as an effective tool for change? And how important is it to you, you know, to become engaged and to use activism as a way to create real and lasting change? I mean, you've seen results yourself, and just for any listeners who would like to follow in your footsteps, what advice would you have for them?
Yeah, so I mean, it kind of starts and ends with the law, because the law sets the parameters of what's acceptable in society and where the obligations lie as regards, you know, who protecting others and the role of the state, and then all of our obligations to each other within society. So the law has to be informed, and it has to be contemporary, and it has to reflect the needs of individuals, but also the needs of society. So, you know, the law is crucial in shaping how we act and how we are expected to act. But, you know, I really believe that good law can only come from lived experiences and respond to the needs. So consultation and engagement with individuals and with society, and obviously, because of the nature of things, with those who have a voice to share experiences. So whether you research and gather the data on lived experiences, but also speak to the need for change, and do so in an informed way that you can reflect on the experiences of other jurisdictions and the learning from their legal frameworks and structures. But activism, I think, in Ireland has shown to be so powerful, particularly in a society where change has been challenging, where change can give rise to kind of being ostracised or isolated for being a different voice too long in Ireland. And so different voices were often silenced. But I think the will of the people has in turn made our politicians more brave and recognised that actually being the one to speak up can be, you know, the most important in the end, and that you will be supported by the people. So activism and vocal activism it has become and has been seen to be the agent for change in Ireland. So I would say to anybody who is studying in this area or has aspirations to work in this area, you know, be brave and be bold and call out change, and you would be amazed what your voice will do for change and will embolden others in turn to support you and to become agents for change. So yeah, I'm all for that.
Brilliant. Well, look, Louise, that's been absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much for taking time
to
speak
both
to us. We really, really appreciate it.
It's always a pleasure.
We look forward to following all of your work and to looking at more at the Bystander Intervention Programme and all of your work around that.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Sarah, and thanks, Jack.
Thanks, Louise.
This podcast was recorded in Granite Podcast Studio. Interested in starting up your own podcast but don't know how? Granite Podcast Studio can help. Record your podcast in our state-of-the-art studio, which is based in the heart of Newry City. Our studio has cutting-edge and user-friendly technology and can seat up to 4 people. We also provide an editing service for our team, using your guidance and editing notes to provide you with a flawless finished product, leaving your listeners wanting more. For more information on how you can get started, visit www.granitepodcaststudio.com.